the chief of police at Northwestern is a senior associate vice president of the university. And I'm finding this is actually, as I've started to do my research, this is common at a lot of universities that person is almost always a Black person at elite universities, and they're also often on the senior leadership of the administration. So these are the, it is police, quite literally university police who are part of senior leadership that are making a lot of these decisions and helping craft what are going to be not only the policies around what protest and what dissent is going to be tolerated or not, but are generally part of administrative decisions for the university and are making universities much more carceral spaces than they not only were figuratively, but are becoming quite literally by having the chief of security, the chief of police be at the table with senior administration. So, other than that physical speaking to me that happened that day, I didn't really hear much from the university until a few weeks later, the House Committee on Education and the Workforce called the president forward. And I think I was on your show that from the job that you've now lost. But between us, thinking how we both either lost or are in danger of losing jobs, but because we're Black, we have lots of jobs, so we're just working in our other jobs right now too. But I think we talked about this when Claudine Gay went up in front of the committee, and so our president was called in front of that committee. I received, it wasn't technically a subpoena, but like I do not preserve documents, do not destroy anything. And I was under a lot of fear that I was going to be brought up at this hearing and potentially to lose my job at that hearing because another Black queer person at Columbia University had been basically fired on the air by the president of their university when asked about him, and just told them, he's not going to ever teach here again. And he was deported just days later because he wasn't a U.S. citizen. He was dependent on his. So that hearing came. I was called one of the goons by Representative Jim Banks, which I took great offense to because
one of the goons.
He showed a picture of us. He showed a picture of us standing in front of the students. And he asked the president, he said, let me ask you about Stephen Thrasher. He's one of the goons who are keeping the police from doing their work.
Republican Congressmember Jim Banks grilled Northwestern University President Michael Schill. He singled out Northwestern University journalism professor Stephen Thrasher, who'd been to the Gaza solidarity encampments at Northwestern in Chicago and other schools as a professor and as a journalist.
Stephen Thrasher, who's one of the goons in the photo behind me. He's a professor of journalism at Northwestern. He and several of your faculty members locked arms. They scuffled with police officers, blocked the police officers on your campus from doing their job. Do they continue to teach students at Northwestern University after this embarrassing incident?
So I will not comment on individual faculty members nor on matters.
Is it your decision and your decision alone to allow those professors to continue to teach students on your campus?
We believe in due process.
Which I felt really chilling. Obviously, I'm personally implicated. But even beyond that, taking myself out of the equation, the idea that the police are there to do work and their work is being interrupted.
The work of what? Manhandling the students, ousting them from the camp. I mean, what is the work?
Yeah, the work is to manufacture the consent. But at the time, the students weren't breaking. They've changed the rules retroactive. They've tried to go after them retroactively. But at the time, the students weren't doing anything wrong. There was nothing about encampments, as I understood it, or being on that lawn. The lawn, by the way, is dedicated to the 6 students who were killed in 1970 at Kent State and Jackson State. So, I'm called one of the goons for trying to physically protect our students, but also to protect their right to free speech and their right to express themselves. And as a journalism professor, I felt, a responsibility to make sure the journalists covering it were safe, and that it was also an opportunity for me to speak about our journalism colleagues who were not safe. So it's called one of the goons, and goon is often used for strike breakers. So I took great offense to that. But I actually started noticing recently that Benjamin Netanyahu is also using that. He's referring to members of Hezbollah or Hamas as goons. Banks also said I was a prognosticator, which I did find funny because that's someone who can tell the future. And if I knew what all was going to happen, I would not need as much anxiety medication as I have needed. But, as absurd as all of this was, it was also extremely frightening. And that I would be called out in the Congress on this, for not only just for protecting my students, but as if I was some kind of pariah. And that has only gotten worse over time. So I left the United States for the summer to go work on my book and found out that the university was trying to arrest me and trying to arrest 4 of us who had been on that line.
And wait a minute. The university was trying to arrest faculty members for supporting students during a student protest.
Yes, about 3 months after the fact. And so the timing of this is really important to point out that, as I already said, I had glowing mid-tenure review renewal of my endowment right before October 7th. October 7th happens. The university seems kind of hunkered down. They don't really talk to me much except to tell me not to destroy documents, do everything with the Congress. The president does not respond to my letter to him about what my experience was, wanting him to know what my experience was before he went to testify on the Hill. And then nothing happens for months. I later found out the House committee, that was run by this homophobe, Virginia Fox, I was trying to remember, where did I first know her name from? And when I looked it up, it was because she had called the killing of Matthew Shepard in the 1990s a hoax. He was a young gay man who was tied to a fence and left for dead. She called that a hoax. So anyway, the House committee had this hearing. And then in June, they had sent a letter to Northwestern saying, you are shameful and you tried to deceive us. And we want to know who are you punishing? And they bring me up in one of these letters. And so it's after they get those letters that the university presses charges against 4 of us. It's just 4 of us. 3 of us are LGBTQ people. There were probably a couple of people on the line. And I want to be clear in saying, I didn't want everyone to be prosecuted, but I assumed when I got the notice that they're going to prosecute all of us. And then when I saw, it's just 4 of us, I've since noticed that it's almost every campus seems to have a Black and usually Black and queer person who's often the most punished face that's stepping in for this process.
Yeah.
So I was out of the U.S., so I wasn't really in danger of arrest, and it's not the kind of thing that they should arrest people for.
But were the others arrested?
I think that we were asked to come into the office of the campus security, and I think that at least one person did, and they were given the summons and told well, we're not going to arrest you, but here's your summons. So I worked with a criminal defense attorney for a month, and I felt pretty good about how it would be, what the odds would be, except I didn't know if I was going to have to come back from abroad to go to court. But I felt pretty good about the odds because the state of Illinois, where I live, has thrown out every case like this. They'd had about 200 at that point, or 250. Any protests, Kim Fox, the state attorney, had thrown out. One of the good Democrats on this issue, one of very, very few, but one of the good Democrats on this issue, who just threw them all out if they were matters of peaceful protest.
And what are the actual charges? What would the charges be?
The charges were interfering with the duties of a police officer. So they were trying to say that because we impeded the police, that we had broken the law. We felt pretty good about the case had it gone actually forward. Considering that there were, the students were just on the lawn, and there was no, there weren't at the time even campus guidelines about that. But regardless, they were trying to prosecute us in this way. And when the first 2 of the 4 of us had their court date, mine was going to be in second batch. I was told that in the court, the judge was kind of why is this in front of me so many months later? And that one of the attorneys raised that there were no arrests. So this is all moot because you're trying to say they interfered with arrests that never happened. Of course, was, personally incensed that they were just picking on four of us. All the charges were thrown out by the state of Illinois the next day after that first court hearing. But that's when I also found out that I was now under internal investigation, and that I was suspended from teaching in the journalism school while this played out. And so, of course, that was very dismaying to me. And then eventually I found out that I didn't know, because this was in July, I didn't know, okay, is this going to happen? Is there going to be a hearing in the next week and it could be resolved? And I go back to class in the fall. It wasn't until a student wrote to me quite upset that they had built their whole schedule around taking my LGBT reporting class, which is it's a class that's, we have them for a 5-hour chunk of time so we can take them on field trips. And so when students do it, it's a huge commitment. They build their whole schedule around it. And so it wasn't until I found out from one of those very upset students that the classes had already been canceled. And so it's been 4 months of hell ever since, trying to get more information.
So they didn't even tell you that your class had been canceled. You had to find out about it from a student?
Yes.
That's outrageous, Dr. Thrasher.
Yeah. And then I had to tell the people that I had, who I typically contract. Some of them were new, but many of them I've had come for me several times, that help out with this class. They either give tours or they come in to give guest talks. With this endowed chair, I have access to money that I can pay people for this. It's not a huge amount of money, but for freelancers, it's a really important part of their, portfolio. And I had also hired an assistant for the course who was an alum who was also depending on that money for the whole term. I'm very grateful I was able to find out another way to hire that person to do some research for me on my book. But I was horrified. I've never, I've always tried to avoid hiring anyone because I've never wanted to lay anyone off or ever have to fire anyone. I'm a longtime union worker myself, so I felt really horrified by that. And so again, the timing of all of this is deeply suspicious and I think damning for them, in that it's not till after the House pushes them that they start coming after me. And one of the, and so the reasons they're trying to say I'm suspended, even though the other people have gone through disciplinary processes and it's been very much about the encampment, with me, they're largely trying to say it's not about the encampment. They're trying to say I'm an incompetent teacher who doesn't care about my students, who creates a hostile environment for students who have opinions different from mine, and that for things I write on social media, which is a clear First Amendment issue, not just a free speech issue, but I'm arguing a First Amendment issue because they are taking their cues from the federal government about what I should be able to say. And the most kind of laughable thing is that the dean says that a speech that I gave at the encampment about how I don't teach students objectivity means that I cannot be a member of the faculty because it's antithetical to their values. And that has stirred up a huge uproar, I think, with people who may or may not agree with me at all, but who are very frightened by the administration putting out that kind of statement about what can be debated. Because the way he frames what I say about objectivity is really misleading. I'm never saying, be willy-nilly and loose and sloppy with your work. I'm saying we have to have a critical analysis, as you and I have talked about, the positionality of what our work. So to come back to the issue that, to put on my professor hat and try to teach a little lesson briefly now,
please,
and go back to what we were talking about at the top of the hour, we have this horrifying situation where these 6 journalists have basically had a hit list price put on their head. And
for those who aren't familiar, it was the IDF, who basically tweeted out, and I don't know how else they communicated this, images of these 6 journalists in Gaza saying that they were either Hamas or Islamic Jihad, that they were terrorists. And we know from the last year, obviously, the implications of what that means for their personal safety.
Yes. And one of them, Hossam Shabat, who I've been in touch with one-on-one, is 21. He's the age of my students. He's an incredibly sensitive and beautiful writer and an incredibly thorough journalist. It's horrifying looking at what's happened to his friends already. Ishmael Al-Ghul, who was in his 20s, was killed, and people I'm sure anyone who's followed the genocide saw his reporting on Al Jazeera. Unfortunately, you may have seen the last image of him, which is just of his pink neck because they blew his head off with a precision missile. And they said after the fact with him, they said that he was, a terrorist. And when they released the documents about him, they said he was made a full Hamas commander in 2007. Well, he was born in 1997, so he would have been 10 when they were commissioned as a. So it's all a lie, it's all made up.
Yeah, of course.
And so it's terrifying seeing that these journalists are being marked this way right now, because we know exactly how much more danger they are now in. But to think about framing and objectivity, there are people who have served in the Israeli military all over the American news media, including, the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic was a prison guard for that. There are people.
And Barak Ravid, who just won that big journalism award, was previously in the IDF, and he's the person through whom a lot of the leaked stories that are useful to the Biden administration come to the press. For example, most recently, the story that, oh no, a Blinken letter was leaked that they didn't want out that showed that they were going to be really tough on Israel, but they were giving them 30 days until after the election to get their act together and let humanitarian aid through, or else, right? And then, of course, that, which many people read as an inducement to, Democratic voters who are disapproving of this genocide, to say, go ahead and vote for Kamala Harris. Don't worry about it. The administration's going to get tough on Israel after the election. And again, just to the point of that it was through Barak Ravid that was leaked to the public.
Correct. And I think Wolf Blitzer used to work for AIPAC. So, there are people who have connections to Israel. And of course, within the United States, there's all kinds of journalists who are veterans of the U.S. military. And so when I talk about objectivity, I say it doesn't exist for anybody. That's not something I teach. I think about how do we critically position ourselves as the makers of journalism and the recipients of journalism, and how do we critically think about the relationships with the Palestinian journalists. I think that there's something really beautiful and valuable to be learned from them in the School of Relational Journalism, which is the kind of journalism I teach and I practice, where you admit and understand that you're in relationship with people that you are writing about. The same is true for, the example I almost always use is, the same is true for front page news writers for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, who are using unnamed sources. They have relationships with those sources. The readers don't get to know what they are. And so you can't kind of situate how you should think about them critically. In relational journalism, we are not only disclosing our relationships, but we're thinking about the fact, particularly for marginalized communities, say, the gay community and the very gay communities and very, very valuable work done in the early years of AIDS around before there was a word for it, trying to understand what is this weird new cancer that some men are having, like understanding your place in the community and your responsibility to the community actually can really create really fantastic journalism. So that's what I teach and what I was talking about on the Meadow that day. And I think that Palestinian journalists have also given us this really beautiful model of thinking about journalism as a public good. And it's not about, if you read their work, it's not about scooping one another. Many of them are not getting paid. Yeah. They're getting paid very piecemeal from different outlets. It's about getting the information to the public that they need, both the people that they live nearby who are trying to stay alive and get access to food and water, but also getting it out to the world. And they do it collectively. And, and I think that's a really beautiful model for young journalists to think about, especially if they are going into an economically precarious news business model where they need to understand how to create unions or how to, have their power together to be able to practice journalism, and to admit that there are things that you need as a journalist to be able to practice your work, which include access to clean water, access to clean air, access to a world that's not completely on fire. And so I know I talked about how these journalists were offering us these really great models for understanding this. So that is being thrown in my face now as I am not, I am unfit to be a member of the faculty because I hold these beliefs. And the most bizarre part of that is that speech, I am continuously in it referencing a book called The View from Somewhere by Lewis Wallace, who I've taught at Medill for years, and who a Medill professor who teaches every first-year student asked me to invite to campus to speak to every first-year student because they knew we had a relationship. Yeah. And they, Lewis spoke to them for 2 years in a row. So it's all a red herring. They got the letter from Congress. They had to find out what to put up, and mine is the head they're trying to put up.
Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.